we can go ahead and introduce our panelists. So we have 4 previous flyers. We have Alexis Hope, Maggie Coblentz, Paula, and Valentina, who have all flown on previous sections of the flight. Have each of you also done the class as well? So almost everyone. They are here they're going to give a brief overview of their projects that they flew, and then we'll spend most of the time letting them answer your questions about, could be anything from their projects to their experiences to advice for your projects. So I'm just been going alphabetical. So Alexis, do you want to kick us off with just a brief background on your project? If you have anything to share, you can be welcome to share it as well.
Is it just like around 5 minutes or so?
Yeah, that's
okay. I don't want to ramble
totally fine.
because I probably can. Nice to meet you all. So the project I worked on was called Spacecraft, and I was it was kind of inspired because at the time I was taking a whole bunch of woodworking classes over at Mass Art. And so I just was really thinking a lot about handcraft and just this sort of like messy, imprecise, inefficient process of making things that I was enjoying at the time. And so when the call for the class around, for the zero gravity class came around, I was trying to think of a project that I really wanted to explore ideas in this space. And so I kind of took what I was thinking about in the craft part of my life and mashed it up with the space part of my life. And so Spacecraft was sort of the idea I came up with there, which I'll show you my project page, I guess. So I started to think about just the idea of making marks in zero gravity. So whether that's sculpture or painting or just sort of any way of making marks in the space around you. I saw this project by Frank Pietronigro. It's a drift painting in microgravity. So this was kind of like the first experiment in painting in zero gravity. So I looked at that, and he sort of immersed himself in this big plastic chamber and just went wild with paint in there, which is very cool, but not something that I could probably pull off in the with the constraints of the class and the flight that we had planned. So I started to think about how to translate that into an experience that could be done in 15 seconds on a crowded plane with a whole bunch of other people. And so what I came up with was my own sort of creativity chamber, that's what he called it, but one that just my hands would go into, and a hot glue gun to kind of prototype this experience of sculpting in space. And what I kind of learned from doing this project, I think, is that this one was a kind of like a performance as much as an artifact. So like the video of myself performing sculpting in space is kind of more evocative and interesting to people than I think like what was created in the first place. So I'll just play this, and then I'll send the link too so you can check it out.
I do love this, Alexis, when you're floating up and your feet are high up above you and still working with your hot glue gun and the sculpting. I love that shot in the video.
Yeah.
Did the Velcro for the battery come off of there, it looked like?
Probably. Many things happened differently than what I thought were going to happen. And we could talk about that more in the Q&A. But I think I'll pass it along to whoever's next then.
Yeah, next is Maggie.
Hi, everyone. This feels like a reunion from our flight. It's so nice to see all these friendly faces that I haven't seen from so long around the world. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, are you seeing my project pages?
Yep.
Okay, so first I can give a little bit of context on my work at SEI, which is interplanetary gastronomy. So if NASA is creating space food products that are more geared towards survival and nutrition, I'm more interested in gastronomy being the key word. So gastronomy is the art and science of cooking, as well as human culture through food. And we're so lucky at the Space Initiative to actually be able to work with astronauts to give us some insights into what it's like to eat in space. But I think astronauts, I mean, they're a very limited user, as you're all aware, and they're also trained out of complaining. And so there's only a certain type of insight that you're really able to get from this user group. So it seemed natural that for my first zero-G experiment, I wanted to experience firsthand what is it actually like from a human perspective to eat and cook in space. So there were two parts to my experiment, and I can break it down further in terms of like how I actually designed the experiment with the parabolas in the Q&A, but I'll just give you an overview on the concept for now. So the first was tasting menu in zero-G. So I developed a 5-course tasting menu with small bites to investigate aroma, sound, flavor profiles of food. And some of the dishes included sounds of mirepoix. So I played the sounds of onions and things being fried on a pan while diffusing the aromas of different foods through this space food helmet to increase the anticipation of a meal. So similar to how we would experience food on Earth. A champagne toast with custom flavored popping candies, because in space you're not going to be able to have carbonated beverages or champagne like you would on Earth. So what could new forms of ritual be in space? Algae caviar, which was a dish that I uniquely created for a zero-G environment. Miso to test umami and specific flavor profiles. And then these silicone bones that I 3D printed and cast to look at new tools for eating in zero-G, because in zero gravity, of course, we don't need to have a traditional flat table and cutlery like we would on Earth. So can we invent entirely new ways of experiencing food, sort of like Willy Wonka style in space? This was my space food helmet, and the initial motivating factor for this helmet was because zero-G required me to have all of my liquids and foods double contained. And I think, Larissa, you had asked a question about that over email. And so this was my creative solution so that I could have the experience of eating food floating through space, since I couldn't actually do this on the flight itself, because they were, of course, worried that these materials would interrupt other people's experiments, but it worked to my advantage. So I was able to make my dream goldfish bowl to have food floating around. And then this was the inspiration, of course. So although astronauts are always telling us about the hardships of eating and living in space, I'm really seeing images like this. And so can we design food experiences and design experiences that enable these playful and whimsical opportunities for not just astronauts, but future space tourists or future space farers? This was some of the inspiration for the design of my space food helmet and spacesuit. I'm not sure, Sean, what zero-G's current policy is for custom suits, so I won't encourage that if it's not allowed, but you've probably all seen that some of our Space Initiative flyers have worn their own suits. So I would encourage it, because I think it adds to the kind of embodied experience. And as Alexis was saying, her experiment was very intentionally performative, but I think that even if that isn't the primary goal, it's such a nice experience to be able to fully embody the, this rare experience of zero gravity in whatever way that you can, if it fits with your experiment. And the next half of my experiment was molecular gastronomy. So on Earth, molecular gastronomy is a sub-discipline of food science that's looking at the chemical and physical properties of food. And you're usually employing certain chemical reactions and ingredients to create spheres, for example. Spherification is possibly one of the more commonly known types of molecular gastronomy. And so if we're looking at zero gravity as a material, like SANS would, like teach us all, zero gravity can become one of the ingredients that we use to cook food, so that a future space chef or space home cook could have these new creative ways of cooking. So in zero-G, there's no surface tension, so we can naturally create these spheres with liquids. So I was not rewriting the wheel by any means, but to use edible materials to explore this, and also thinking along the lines of Alexis in terms of what is, craft and making, but again, my material is food. And so I created these spheres of liquid with other flavors embedded inside, and you could have this full 365-degree surface to decorate or imagine how cuisine will transform in the future. This is my beautiful glove box. And this is an example of a dish that I created on Earth with traditional molecular gastronomy techniques. But the idea is that these cooking techniques and applications that I was exploring in 0G could be applied to a dish like this, which was inspired by the overview effect and looking back at planet Earth and what are new dishes we would eat to celebrate these rare moments in space. I have some, I don't know if this is a good time, Sean, so you tell me what works for the panel, but I have a few other images that just show my process from the CDR and the kind of Conops review. Is this a good time to show them, or should I wait for the Q&A to maybe go into some of those details?
Let's wait for the Q&A, and we'll let Paula go next.
Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Paula. I was not the person of the team in the 0G class. Another person in our team was in there, but I think I got really much involved in the class at the end. And the project that I ended up testing in the 0G is called FLAPS, the Folded Lightweight Actuation Positioning System. And it's a mouthful. And the big idea of FLAPS is that when you have small satellites, especially like CubeSats in space, sometimes you really need to actuate some surfaces repeatedly into specific angles. And the actuations that you have in the market, the actuators that you have in the market are either like bulky and heavy, like big hydraulic systems or big motors with gears and etc. that would be too big and heavy and power hungry for a small satellite like a CubeSat. Or on the other hand, they are single-use actuation, like a spring that pops up or something that breaks and releases. And neither of those solve the problem of, for example, having a solar panel that looks towards the sun every time, depending on where the spacecraft is. And we tried solving that problem using something called SMA, or shape memory alloys. Let me share this really quick video. Okay, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a piece of SMA here on the top, and this is hot water. And when I place this SMA inside the hot water, it would just move. And that's the beauty of the SMA. You just change the temperature of it and it goes back to the shape that it was trained to be, the shape that it has the memory at. That's why it's a shape memory alloy. And what we were proposing in our project called FLAPS was to use this change of temperature, giving an actuation to actuate surfaces in small spacecrafts. And we would do that using 2 wires and having a different voltages and currents, and through that and Joule effect, we would make the SMA get hotter or not so hot. And with that temperature gauging, we would change the positioning of this SMA and then change the position of the actuated system. And so I brought some pictures to show how it works. And so this is in the end how our hinge was, and this is the hinge that we tested in the 0G. So we had 2 SMAs, one of them would bend in one direction, the other one would bend in the other direction, and then we had an encoder and all the electronics going behind. And then we would be able to set the angle we wanted the flaps, the hinge to go, and then the entire electronics and control boards would put the hinge in that specific angle. And when we tested it in 0G, we had to also come up with some way that we could, instead of having like a laptop controlling everything, we would have some type of panel that would just click the buttons and it would go to where we wanted. So this is how we ended up doing this panel for controlling everything. And this is our mock CubeSat and the hinge that ended up going in 0G. And as Maggie said, I had like some photos here of the process when the 3 students in the project were working on this and how it ended up going, the full assembly and going to flight. But I think we can talk more about this in the Q&A. And I love this photo.
Yeah, that's a really good one.
I have to say, Paula had some of the best 0G floating photos with the hair. It was really good.
we'll go on to Valentina.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm going to share some details about my project. And I don't know, you can see my screen. So mainly, the name is Space Human, and was meant to be a study on how we can implement a soft robotic exoskeleton that can be wearable for enhancing mobility in microgravity. And this project has been done with a teamwork, mainly with the work of a designer, Manuel Mucillo, who was visiting here at MIT Media Lab Space Exploration Initiative. And together we had this idea of how we can help everyone to become sort of astronauts and travel in the solar system. And so we started this analysis, trying to define which could be the users of this experiment. And so we define an astronaut, a space tourist, a space colonist, and we start and try to understand which could be the features of this component that could be very helpful for a person. And so we start analyzing what NASA has at the moment. Is a sort of body restraint tether. It is a tool that is used to anchor to handles within the International Space Station and during extravehicular activities, but is a sort of object that is actually not active, so it's very passive. And our idea was, what if we could design a sort of body restraint tether that can be active? And so we started analyzing the undersea world, and we got inspired by seahorses. Indeed, seahorse is like space human. And so we tried to design this prosthetic soft robotic tail to navigate in microgravity. And so we got inspired by also other soft robotics project that has been developed in MIT Media Lab as well, and also at MIT Self-Assembly Lab with using air to shape these prosthetics. And we define a lot of some numbers to try to simulate how it would bend inside the 36 air chambers. And the idea here is when the pump are actuated, the airflow within the air chambers and change their configuration in order to help the person who is wearing it to rebalance it himself. And now we are advancing these, adding object tracking camera in order to try to recognize a target and try to grab it in microgravity, because in microgravity it's impossible to stay still. And so this idea will also help space tourists that don't have an astronaut training to be anchored in the environment. And in this picture you see one of the co-authors of the project, Manuel Mucillo. And the main thing was, as you say, was tested inside the zero-G flight last year. And this was my first microgravity parabola. It was the behavior of the tail was kind of unexpected. I mean, I didn't know how to behave in microgravity, so I was a bit scared in a way, because the tail was acting as a propulsion system. And when I activated the tail, I was not able to actually control my body. And at the beginning it was kind of hard, but then after a few parabolas, I got better. And here you can see here now is the tail that is changing its configuration. And while it changed, just to change my body posture, is kind of creating angular momentum through my body. And now for the next zero-G flight, one of our collaborators will fly again, and trying to also use the object tracking camera to reach a target. And this is the sequence. So for each parabola, we kind of set a sort of a different behavior of the tail for last flight, and different timing for the activation of the air pumps. And this was important because each parabola, as you know, just lasts 30 seconds. So I had to, even 20. So I had to be very precise and consistent with the parabola flight. And I used this experiment in the zero-G flight to collect some data. We were adding sensor who were detecting the bending of the tail in different parts along the text side. It was wrapping up all the air chambers, and I was also collecting my personal biodata to see how stressful was the experiment. And so this is overall the idea. And it was a very interesting experience, and it really fascinates me, the idea of floating in air and without, for example, a medium like water, as we used to swim underwater, right? But not in the air. So it was really magic.
Thank you. I'm trying to get the view back to, okay. Well, thanks to all of our panelists for those introductions. Now I want to hand it over to the anyone in the class who has any sort of questions for anyone.
I have a question for Valentina, actually. So you're talking about like you were trying to get acclimated to the environment so you could like perform these movements. That's something for my experiments, I'm going to have to like perform specific movements. Do you have any recommendations for that, whether like having someone there to help or just getting acclimated and things like that?
Yes, absolutely. So I had a person that was a zero-G trainee person who was helping me at the very early stage, at the very beginning, to start understanding how was my my body movements and the tail behavior. So many things were unknown. But the main thing I think is important that is keep it simple in a way, because there are many things happening at the moment. There are many people are moving around all around you, and I would suggest you maybe to start maybe with just one movement for each parabola and then increase your movements. So when the picture that I showed before, while I was in this vertical position upside down, this was my I guess 5th parabola, something like that. So I had to a little bit get used to the environment, and at the very beginning I was just too scared to be upside down. So I think just consider that option. So it's not it's easy, but you really need to feel comfortable in doing certain movements. And something that also would suggest is probably try at the very beginning to try to find an anchor point, because otherwise you get scattered inside the aircraft, and there's it's very hard then to come back down to the ground.
Someone once suggested to me that you could train on monkey bars at a park. If you have things that are hanging upside down, you could start to plan and choreograph some of your movements. I don't know exactly what you're trying to do, but it seems like a fun training process anyway.
There's also a friend of SEI who does a lot of choreography, who we can connect you with if you're interested. But they've been hanging themselves from kind of like a center point so that they can hover over the ground. They're practicing juggling, and they were curious to know how, by moving around, they could continue to coordinate juggling. So yeah, there's some people get really creative with the ways that they try and simulate this.
One last thing just to add there, that the parabolas are really short. Like you start the parabola, you start going into 0G and you're like, yes, I'm loving this. Okay, now let me do the experiment. And then, oof, the 0G is done. So it really needs to be in the first couple of parabolas, really use those to understand the 0G and get into it. So the following ones, you understand how short they are, and you can effectively focus on doing the experiment.
One more thing on that point, I guess I did my experiment kneeling because the parabolas were so short. So I didn't actually lie down at each time, and that was a way to try and maximize the most out of the 15 seconds and actually be able to sculpt something. But it also was a little bit more taxing on the body because it felt very, very heavy if you're kneeling during that time. So something to think about.
I might have a question for Valentina too. So I'm also trying to work on a suit that would enables people to attach to surfaces, but with magnetic field. And it looks like it's very messy during the flight. And you were a bit struggling, if I understood well, to grab. So I didn't really see what were you trying to attach? Just bars and yeah, how
Yes. So for my last flight, we were just trying to understand the behavior of the tail and trying to predetermine the activation of the air pumps with a predefined set of curvature and bending, and to understand how it was determining the orientation of my body posture. But in the next flight in May, we are gonna try to really detect a target and grab that target given our previous data of our last flight.
Okay, makes sense.
So we are not there yet.
Okay.
We're working on it because it's very hard. Also because as soon as you define a target, you are already moving. And so once you try to get the target, your body change position in the meanwhile. And so it's very hard to have this dynamic reconfiguration of the tail in order to really grab an handle. And so this is the main issue there. Because you can't stay still. So the best thing to try to do that. So what we are figuring is just stay meaning or be, in a way, sit and stable, and then try to just having the tail moving around and grab the objects. Otherwise, if I start moving because of the tail is moving, then there won't be possible to reach any target.
Okay. So in my case, if you had any advice, as I'm going to try to use magnetic field to attach, do you think that it needs a lot of power because it's very messy, it's moving a lot? Or do you think it can still be reasonable once we're docked? It doesn't need that much power.
Well, I don't know. I will have to know more about your project.
Yeah,
Maybe we
okay.
can reconnect offline and talk
fair
more
enough.
about it. But I think it's a good idea. Also, I think when I was talking to some astronauts, the suggestion they gave me just put some magnets at the very end of the tail to really get anchored to some target. So I think it might work very, very well.
Thank you.
Ariel, have we ever had any kind of like handlebars mounted on the floor? I mean, it would be pretty simple to set something up like that given the bolt hole availability, but.
No handlebars. They could do a double long strap and you can use it kind of similarly, but of course it doesn't give you the same rigidity if you're actually wanting to bend around that pivot point. We have had people install longer bars on their 80-20 frames. So if you have an 80-20 frame like Xing, who does a lot of the dancing and the fashion deployment in zero-G, then you can definitely install your own handlebar and pivot around that. But interesting question. We could definitely, if one of you is keenly interested in having a handlebar on the flat mat, if you can find one that would fit the length or fab one that would fit the length between the two bolts, I suspect that is something zero-G would allow us to bolt in.
Yeah, I was just thinking of some people that were, had the unique challenge of trying to keep themselves at least, in one pivot while they operated. I mean, you've all seen some of these pictures now of there's some of the best pictures where somebody's legs are up behind them and they're still able to kind of work on their project. So there's a fun and a beauty to that aspect. But if you're trying, if one of your major challenges is, I don't know how I'm gonna like stay in place or not pivot away, then it might be worth us thinking about what kind of scaffolding we can build for that.
I might be building something that could be useful for that.
Sorry. Okay, I had a handle in my setup and it was really, really useful in the 80-20, as Ariel was explaining before.
As did I, because one of my glove box was raised, so I had two handlebars on the glove box, and I was kneeling, but it's still helpful to just have something to grab onto if you are feeling off balance, which you probably will be.
Handles are also helpful for loading your experiment on loading day. So that's something that Zero-G recommends you install. So dual purpose.
It's a pretty cheap addition too, so yeah, I think about that.
I've got a question for Maggie. Can you talk a little bit about the process going? You mentioned you had some things to show for going through PDR or TDR.
Sure. I will share my screen. Again, it's nothing fancy, but it always helps to get a visual of what that day looks like. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so this is the day. Are you guys seeing what I'm seeing, pictures on a page?
Yep.
Just to make sure. Okay. So this is the day before the flight, where we are demonstrating what our experiment's going to be. So this just, you probably are already familiar with what this process is going to look like, but just so you know, like the level of detail that they're looking for. I mean, you can literally see me here inside my helmet. I had to demonstrate exactly which movements I was going to be making. And they gave me some great advice and really tried to scale back my experiment, because I think it's really natural for people to try to do too many things. And my experiment in particular had many steps. And they were also cautioning me that the food would fly up my nose and my ears, which it did, but that was a sacrifice I was willing to make.
So real quick, Maggie, to clarify, this is the TRR, right?
TRR, yes.
With Zero-G.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks. They were concerned that my helmet would be a safety hazard or a choking hazard. So if you do have any kind of wearable straps, they will want you to really outline for them how you can take it off and put it back on in various situations. So here is Ariel and I posing with my beautiful spacesuit. These were my Conops. I'm sure Sean's been drilling this into your head, but it really is important to write them out line by line and just tape them in the most obvious places ever. So I had a copy of mine taped onto my glove box, also on the floor below my experiment, so that if you have a split second and forget your step, you can just reference it in all these different places. You can see here some of my different containment levels. So for anyone bringing liquids onto the plane, it's like going through regular airport security. So you should just think of it in that way. Not in terms of the quantities you can bring, but it has to be sealed, and you have to give it to them in a sealed package so that they can confirm that it is the material you claim it is. And then once I was on the flight, I had the opportunity to load my syringes. I think they, in the end, allowed me to preload some of them, but those are all questions you should ask in advance in relation to your specific experiment, just to figure out exactly what that process will look like for you to make it super easy. And I had this Tupperware bin at the bottom of my box, of my glove box as well, so that I could store things. And of course, in between each parabola and Hyper-G, all of the liquids just come crashing down to the bottom, as they do in gravity. And so that creates a mess, and I had to quickly wipe it up. And those are some things that I didn't plan for. Before I forget, another pro tip is actually just really thinking of your glove box as a photo booth, which I did not. And so my glove box has clear walls so that I can see inside it, but you might consider adding an opaque piece of paper on the bottom or on one of the back sides, so that you can capture photos without the disruption of what you would see on the outside. So just really planning for all of that and positioning your GoPros in advance inside your box. I had one, I think here you can see in more detail. So this is us installing in the plane, which was, I thought it was super cool just to see a gutted airplane like this. I'd never been inside something like that. And so yeah, here's all my loaded syringes and then my GoPros, which I'd pre-positioned. So just that, all those details for install could also be outlined in part of your Conops as well, because you will likely forget something. And then my last slide is just to show whatever you want your hero image to be. Documentation means something different for everybody. For some people, it's to document results. And then for other people, it's actually part of your storytelling. And I would encourage all of you to think of it in that way if you can. And so I was trying to achieve looking like this guy here. That was not going to be possible because it turns out eating in Zero-G is not the most attractive thing that a person could do. So I ended up choosing these types of shots as my hero shots. But if you can try your best to imagine how you're going to capture those moments, and we're really lucky to work with an amazing photographer, and he actually does his best to, oh, sorry, am I stopping sharing now? He does his best to come over to your experiment at a certain moment, if he can, coordinate with everybody else to help you get that best shot. So if Rachel, you're trying to acclimate for the first few parabolas, you can instruct him to maybe try to come over on the 10th parabola when you're feeling slightly more adjusted to get your beautiful upside down shot.
Is he around during the TRR? How does he know?
He was, yeah. So a lot of those, I don't know that he will be this time around, but he was. So for the TRR, he's just going around taking, pictures of everybody setting up, but then, and for install. So most of the pictures I showed, if they looked high quality, it's because he took them. And if they did not, they were something I took myself.
There's also a lot of downtime the morning of. So we're already loaded in the afternoon prior, we go home, we come back the morning of to get on the flight. And there's usually about 30 minutes or an hour where we're all milling around waiting to get the call that we can get on the plane. And that's another really great chance to catch Steve, that's his name, Steve Boxall. We're gonna contract with the same guy in May of next year. And what's helpful is to really scope out what type of photo captures you want, to the point of like writing yourself a little list. Especially that morning, if you've taken the scopolamine, you might be a little bit loopy. So it helps to just have it documented somewhere what types of body shots or boxed shots you want, and go up to Steve and say, hey, this is what I want. And maybe he'll take it from you, or he'll just remember, and then he'll have your face and your project to remember to come and photograph.
Do you recommend taking scopolamine to almost everyone?
I don't push it on anyone. It's completely your choice. No one is forced to take anything to join the flight. That is completely your decision and your doctor's decision. But the vast majority of flyers do choose to go to MIT Medical or wherever your doctor provider is, your PCP provider, and get a prescription for scopolamine. Most people choose that. It tends to be a very effective way to be comfortable on the flight.
Because otherwise, most people get a little weird with this up and down. Yeah.
I don't know. I can't say because I've never not taken it. The only people who we generally have who don't take it are people who are doing VR or vestibular sensing experiments, where they explicitly don't want to mitigate the feeling of space sickness because they want that feeling to see if their experiment is successfully counteracting it, or if they're able to do what they need to do with it in the way that an astronaut might. But I have never known someone who took it to feel ill. So I do think it works quite well. The people who don't take it, like the VR people, also because they're having their vision taken away, can get even a little bit more upset.
Thank you.
I highly recommend it. I get terribly seasick and even nauseous in the car, so I was really nervous, but I was completely fine. And I was eating and I was in a helmet, so I think that in many ways I was in a very bad, possibly bad situation, and I was totally fine. So it does work. And this is probably obvious, but because of COVID and everything going on, I would just give even more time than usual to get an appointment with your doctor for the prescription, and then also get the prescription from the pharmacy, because it's not necessarily something that all pharmacies have on hand.
Thank you.
I'll just add one detail to that, which is start planning now to have a good night's sleep beforehand, because not having any sleep and then taking scopolamine is fairly disorienting. Not that I know from experience or anything. But yeah, just plan to have everything kind of taken care of. Like set yourself a deadline of like a couple days before the flight to do your final personal check.
Do we have any other questions for the panelists?
If not, or if people are still thinking of questions, I will ask what the most surprising thing that any of the panelists experienced in terms of like the difference between planning for the flight and then getting on the flight and having the experience. Yeah, does anything jump out as, wow, I wish I had known that before, or I would have done this differently?
I would say for me, it was just really small things. Because I had positioned everything in my glove box on the ground based on how I would my normal postures. And then in zero gravity, just even kind of how your elbows and arms are floating. And my experiment was really relying on some hand movements, that was different. So as much as you could imagine what that might feel like, or if it's possible to automate the process, now looking back, I think it's ridiculous that I was even attempting to use my syringes by hand. I could have probably easily set up some kind of automatic system. So if there's any opportunities to do that, so that you can just kind of coordinate other aspects of it, that would be really helpful. So I'd say that's what surprised me the most. And then just how quickly time goes by, but people will tell you that over and over again. And there's only so much you can do to plan for it, but it really is like designing a stunt. That's how it felt. Or maybe that's the fantasy I have in my head, but.
No, I think it's a really useful metaphor, actually.
For me, I think the thing I would have gone back and told myself was to have more fun with it. Because if I look at my photos, like the very first half of the flight, I'm like very serious looking, trying to like sculpt this thing, but those do not come across well at all. So I think like as I got more comfortable and started to have more fun and joy with the process, the photos came out better, the experiment came out better because I was more relaxed and expressive. So just in my case, there was like there's a lot of stress I was carrying into it because it is, you know, you don't have much time and all that, but I do think like relaxing a bit was very helpful. So I would suggest that.
I might have a question for you, Alexis. If you tried outside of 0G, I assume it would behave differently. And did you succeed to do something with the same tools that you were happy with? Because it seemed to be pretty difficult anyway. Do you have any, I don't know, did you take more experience over time, and maybe would you try again and follow another 0G flight?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I would want to use a different tool probably because there's only so much resolution you get from a glue gun. And I think it was a great way to prototype the idea and see what that experience would even be like. But I think a more precise tool would be needed to sculpt anything. And also the 15-second constraint is, I think no matter the tool, I actually think that is a bigger constraint. You just don't have a lot of build time and you can't make the material move out too much faster while still having control. So it's a tough problem with the amount of time.
Yeah, I think in many ways you're forced into over designing your experiment because of the length of the parabolas, but there's also something to be said for giving yourself room for spontaneity and what is intuition in 0G, and can you kind of give yourself that creative space, if you will, if you have the opportunity in your parabolas.
Yeah, one thing on that point, because this was actually really important for mine. I was kneeling and I had strapped down the back of my leg so I wouldn't go anywhere. And then I think about halfway through the flight, I was like, I need to unstrap my legs and I need to be floating and I need to do that. And that's where actually all of the good videos came from. So that was not in my Conops. I don't know, you know, that's definitely controversial, but in my case, that room to experiment was necessary, I think. Yeah.
I just want to jump in and say, I think that that's fantastic. And so we heavily emphasize the Conops because there's no substitute for planning. There's no substitute for being prepared. But you can follow your intuition like Alexis did during the flight and adapt. And that's what an astronaut would be expected to do on the International Space Station, is adapt and think about a different way to maneuver your body. Just like Valentina was also sharing that she adapted throughout the flight to the experience of the tail. So I think that's a really nice insight, Alexis.
And also adding something on top of that, Ariel, thank you for mentioning that after a few parabolas, I understood even if the timing was perfectly set to last the entire on and off, the real duration of a parabola, then because you were a little bit disorienting, once you get, you lose a few seconds, and those seconds are very important. So I started activating the air pumps before the parabola. And so I had a little bit more time to even to adjust and play with the tail somehow. And then something that I was really unexpected, that I was in front of Chin. And while I was doing my thing with the tail, at some point I was looking in front of me. There was Chin, beautiful with his amazing dress, floating and doing a lot of performance. I was like, oh wow! I was like, I want to look around and see what other people are doing. It was beautiful.
One thing similar to what Maggie said is that I learned from my experiment that I would have done different this time is how the ergonomics was made. So our box was really flat on the floor. It was like long and wide, but it was short. And when we were testing it, we had it on top of a table, and we would like go to all the controls and all the buttons that were on this really low surface, and we would play with it, and it was super easy. But then in the 0G flight, it was on the ground and I was kind of floating. So I would have to always like try to push me really down on the floor to be able to look at the controls and know where to click. So one thing, like if your experiment happens to be something like that too, try to somehow put the control panel or whatever you're going to click in a surface that if you are floating above it, you can still see it and you can still reach it.
I think that's a fantastic recommendation, and a good example of something that just, of course, you don't think about when you're designing something on the ground. I guess one extra comment on that is that if you, say, had a really large piece of material on the top and you falling on top of that while pressing the buttons because gravity kicked back in is a possibility, then I would just think about that, or think about rails along the top of it, for instance, if you need to be close to it in that way. But yeah, and if you have a 3D model of your project, then like use that to find vantage points, you know, look at your project from different angles and kind of pretend to be in zero gravity, and that might give you some insight.
And I think a few people reference this, but as much as you can take advantage of the hyper-G moments, that's really helpful. So they tell you that you're supposed to lie back, which you should, to mitigate the effects of motion sickness. But if you're able to position your arms or set up your tools, or even writing into your Conops some kind of like a mental preparation that you're going to do, I think all of those things would be really helpful, because it's a full, I think it's longer than how long is the hyper-G? I don't remember, but I mean, it's time that you can use. So time is precious.
We might have time for just one more question if anyone has something.
Maybe I have a quick one for Paula. I was curious about your SMA actuator. I assume it would potentially, I mean, it looked like it was made to be sent in the ISS or in another kind of flight. Is it the plan?
Yes, so we are building a satellite now. So this is going to go to space in orbit. And the big idea, the big reason why we wanted to use 0G, and it was really useful, was when we were testing that hinge here, like on ground, we wouldn't know if the actuation was going like low because the gravity was pushing it down, or if it would also have this weird actuation if it was without this gravity pushing it down. So being able to go in 0G was like, oh, okay, so now we know how it really actuates in 0G. And then that was really useful for us to continue the planning and putting it into an effective satellite that is like going to fly into launch. And we ended up getting together with the Aerospace Corporation, and they got with us and we sat down and we had a lot of meetings to discuss the ideas, and they ended up implementing something similar to what we tested in the 0G in their CubeSat, and it's theoretically going to fly late this year. So it's going to be like really, really nice, really good outcomes.
That's great. I was curious about how this would behave outside of our nice cozy environment, because the temperatures would definitely affect the behavior. And how do you, I mean, is it fine? The electricity is just making it hot enough and it's all good?
Yeah, we made a lot of thermal modeling to make sure that in space it will get the temperature high at the point that it should be, and then bring it back to the low level. And some things we yet don't understand and we still are not sure if it will be able to come back to the low temperature and come back to the resting position. So that's the reason why we're doing this small portion of a satellite with the Aerospace Corporation, because they have it there just in the edge of their satellite. And then if it ends up not working, it's fine. Like their big payload is the most important thing. And if it does work, then awesome. We prove a lot what they were doing. But it's really nice to have this opportunity to fail, at least I think. And we had first the opportunity to fail in the zero-G flight to understand how it would happen. And now we have the chance to fail in this other small satellite project. And you learn so much with those failures and with being open to try it out. And I think that after we get those data, then we will be able to effectively like do one hinge that will work and it will be effective in a zero gravity space environment.
Did you get to test it in the fridge or in freezer?
Not yet. Not yet. Yet.
I think it makes sense. Good.
It makes a nice point that you know, even if what you're trying to do in zero gravity doesn't do exactly what you intend, that's still a success. Like, I wouldn't consider that a failure. Like, this is a great environment to test things in. And, you know, if Paula found out that the SMA material just didn't work for her, then that would be more information to further the work that she's doing. Obviously, you want it to do what you want it to do, but.
I have one final point, because I just thought of this when Paula referenced data. I think a lot of people are looking for quantitative data, but it's important to also be thoughtful about how you collect your qualitative data, which includes your human experience, your personal experience. And so it could be as simple as having a piece of paper in a zipped pocket that as soon as the flight is over, you quickly jot down some diary notes. But if you're collecting, if you want to document this emotional experience or sensory experience, that's really challenging. That's something that I think I could have improved on. So trying to plan for that as well.
I'm tempted to say we make that a requirement. I really wish I had done that. I know we had a bunch of really kind of like embodied and like fresh ideas right immediately after the flight or even halfway through the flight.
Mm.
Yeah, everybody should have a notebook.
Yeah. Or like you could record it on your phone.
Yeah, Sean, let's make that, this can be a meta learning for this year. We can buy everybody a tiny notebook because we all have flight suits and you can have one in your pocket. So let's just buy everybody a small notebook and we can send everybody up with like one of those little mini pens, which I think I did fly with 1 year myself.
Space pen?
Not the space pen, but yeah, it's a little mini pen. Let's just make that something that we pass out to everybody the morning of the flight. If you can just note that down for us, Sean, so we remember to do that in May. I think that's actually a really nice thing. And then, because we do, you know, you get off the flight and you're exhausted, but you're all sitting at the tables for a little while until the bus comes to take us back home. So I think we do have a natural time when we could encourage people to do that.
Yeah, great idea.
Ariel has some really good, the whole bus sleeping on the way home.
Oh my God, it's adorable. I don't know why I didn't fall asleep. I think I've done it enough times now that I don't get as tired, but I have really cute photos of the entire busload. Like somebody had just like put sleeping gas in or something, like everyone's out. But that's usually like an hour after the flight, you know, it's like you're finally gotten on the bus and you loaded your experiments and you're getting to go home. So it's allowable to fall asleep if you're tired.
Yeah.
All right, folks. With that, let me thank the panel. Thank you so much for coming to chat. These are some really great questions from the Q&A as well. So I feel like it's nice always to have people who had direct experience, because as much as Sean and I and Sans, who's been joining these calls, might tell you what we remember, there's no substitute for the diversity of experience and different diversity of projects. So thank you, ladies, so much for coming. It's really nice to see you all.